Imagine this. One moment you're alive, living your normal busy life. The next moment your heart stops. Everything fades away. What happens then? Is it just darkness, or is there something more? This is not a story of imagination. This happened to me. For 10 minutes I was dead. And in those 10 minutes, I saw what no one else has seen, a vision of what's coming. What I'm about to share could change your life forever. My name is Abigail Thompson, and I was a doctor working in a busy hospital in Seattle. My life was predictable and full of routines. I woke up early every morning, grabbed coffee on the way to work, and spent long hours caring for patients. On the outside, everything looked perfect, but deep down I often felt that something was missing. It was a Saturday morning in December 2022. I remember the rain hitting the hospital windows as I rushed through my shift. The day felt like any other, yet I had an odd feeling that I couldn't explain. I glanced at the clock. It was 11:42 a.m. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. Before I could call for help, my vision went dark. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I found myself in a place unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't dark or light, it was just endless. The air was alive with an energy I could feel deep inside me. Then I saw him. A man clothed in radiant light stepped forward. His presence was overwhelming yet calming. I knew instantly who he was. It was Jesus. He didn't speak right away. He looked at me with eyes full of love, yet they seemed to see every part of me, even the parts I tried to hide. I wanted to kneel before him, but I couldn't move. It wasn't fear that held me still, but a feeling of awe that I can't put into words. Finally he spoke, and his voice was like a soft breeze and a rushing river at the same time. "Abigail," he said, "you are here for a reason. There is something I must show you, something the world needs to hear." Before I could ask any questions, the scene around me began to change. It was like being transported to a different time and place. I was no longer in that still, infinite space. Instead, I found myself in a city unlike any I had ever seen. The streets were full of people, and everywhere I looked, there were screens and signs promoting a tiny device. The advertisements said it would make life easier and more secure. People were lining up to get it implanted in their hands or foreheads. "It will make everything more convenient," said a young man in line. "No more wallets or keys, and you'll never lose anything important." At first glance, it looked like progress. People seemed excited. They called it the next step in human evolution. But something about it felt wrong. Jesus stood beside me, watching the scene. His face was full of sorrow. "They think this is the answer," he said. "But it is a trap." I wanted to understand more, but before I could ask, everything changed again. I was back in the hospital. My chest burned as if it were on fire. I gasped for air, surrounded by doctors and nurses who looked relieved to see me alive. I had been dead for 10 minutes, but what I experienced in those 10 minutes changed my life forever. As I lay in that hospital bed, my heart was pounding. I wanted to believe that what I had seen was just a dream, but deep down I knew it was real. Before I could even process everything, Jesus appeared again. This time, it felt like I was being pulled back into the vision. I was no longer in the hospital. Instead, I found myself standing in the middle of a bustling city, much like the one I had seen earlier. It was filled with towering screens and bright advertisements. Everywhere I looked, there were messages promoting the small device. "Get it now and live a simpler life," one advertisement blared. Another screen showed smiling families, happy workers, and promises of a better, safer world. I noticed people walking in and out of clinics with satisfied expressions, proudly showing off the tiny implant in their hands or foreheads. "Life will be so much easier," a young mother said as she held her child's hand. "We won't have to worry about wallets or identification anymore. It's the future," an older man said to his friend. "No more crime, no more fraud. Everything will be connected." It all seemed harmless, even helpful, but I couldn't ignore the pit in my stomach. Jesus stood beside me, his expression heavy with sadness. "This is how it begins," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What starts as convenience will lead to control. They think they are gaining freedom, but they are giving it away." Before I could respond, the scene shifted again. I was in a large boardroom filled with important-looking men and women. Charts and graphs covered the walls, and a sleek presentation played on a massive screen. A man in a sharp suit stood at the head of the table, holding up the tiny device. "This will solve everything," he said with confidence. Poverty, crime, economic instability, all gone. Imagine a world where everyone is connected, where no one is left behind. The others in the room nodded in agreement. We will make it universal, he continued. At first it will be optional, but soon it will become necessary. People won't even question it. They'll see it as progress. I felt a chill run down my spine. The way he spoke was convincing, almost seductive. Jesus leaned closer to me. Do you see? He asked. They will present it as the solution to the world's problems. But it is a lie. It is the beginning of a system that will enslave them. The scene shifted again. This time, I was standing in the middle of a busy street. Long lines of people stretched down the sidewalks, waiting to enter clinics. It wasn't just the poor or the desperate. It was everyone, young, old, rich, and poor. I overheard snippets of conversations as I walked by. I don't see the harm in it, a young man said to his friend. It's just a chip. It's not like it's controlling me. It's just technology, a woman assured her husband. Think about how much easier life will be for us. Jesus watched silently as the lines grew longer. Finally, he spoke again. They don't realize what they are giving up, he said. This isn't just a physical mark. It is a spiritual choice. It represents trust in man's systems over faith in God. As I listened, I began to see the truth. The chip wasn't just a tool for convenience. It was a way to control people, to strip them of their freedom and their connection to God. But most couldn't see it. They were blinded by promises of safety and progress. The vision ended abruptly, and I found myself back in the still, infinite space where I had first met Jesus. His face was filled with both love and urgency. Abigail, he said, the world must know what you have seen. Tell them, warn them. There is still time, but the choice is coming quickly. I nodded, though my heart was heavy. I didn't know how I would explain this to anyone, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. The peaceful, infinite space where I stood with Jesus slowly faded, and I was thrust back into another vision. This time, I found myself in a crowded shopping mall. People were rushing around, carrying bags, chatting with friends, and enjoying their day. But something felt different. As I walked through the mall, I noticed that many people had small devices glowing faintly under their skin. The devices were in their hands or on their foreheads. Signs plastered across the walls encouraged people to visit a clinic located within the mall. Don't get left behind, a cheerful voice announced over the intercom. Upgrade your life today and experience the future of convenience and security. I followed a group of people heading toward the clinic. There was a line outside the door that stretched down the hall. Families, couples, and even children stood patiently, waiting for their turn. I overheard a young couple talking in line. This will make things so much easier, the man said. No more carrying around a wallet or worrying about losing our IDs. The woman nodded. And think about how safe we'll be. They said it can track anyone in case of an emergency. A man standing behind them chimed in. It's not just about convenience. Soon, it'll be required. Better to get it done now than be caught off guard. The pressure to conform was growing. People weren't just choosing the device. They were being subtly forced into it by the system. Suddenly, the scene changed, and I was standing in a workplace. A group of employees had gathered in a conference room. Their manager stood at the front, holding a small device in his hand. Listen up, the manager said. Starting next month, this will be mandatory for all employees. Without it, you won't be able to access the building or your workstations. It's not negotiable. One employee raised her hand. What if we don't want to get it? Are there other options? The manager's tone became cold. There are no other options. If you refuse, you will no longer be employed here. This is the direction the company is moving in, and we expect everyone to comply. I could feel the fear and tension in the room. Some people nodded reluctantly while others exchanged worried glances. One man muttered under his breath, "We don't really have a choice, do we?" The scene shifted again. Now I was in a school. Children sat at their desks, and a teacher stood at the front of the classroom. She held up a small device and explained how the school would soon require it for all students. "This is for your safety," she said with a warm smile. "With this, we can ensure that no child gets lost, and emergencies can be handled quickly. It's a simple step to make our school a better place." A young boy raised his hand. "What if my parents don't want me to get it?" The teacher's smile faded slightly. "Well, without it, you won't be able to attend school, but I'm sure your parents will understand how important this is." I felt my chest tighten as I watched. It wasn't just adults who were being pressured, it was children too. The choice was being taken away from everyone, little by little. Jesus appeared beside me again, his presence comforting, but his expression serious. "This is how it will spread," he said. "What starts as optional will soon become mandatory. They will use fear to force people into compliance. Fear of losing their jobs, their education, their safety. But the price of accepting this mark is far greater than they realize." The vision shifted once more, and I found myself in a home. A family was sitting at the dinner table, deep in discussion. The father was holding a letter from his workplace, which stated that all employees must get the device implanted by the end of the month. "What are we going to do?" the mother asked, her voice trembling. "If you don't get it, we'll lose your income. How will we survive?" The father sighed heavily. "I don't want to get it, but I don't see another option. We can't afford to lose my job." Their teenage daughter spoke up. "But isn't this what the Bible warned about? The mark of the beast? We can't just give in." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The family looked at each other, torn between their faith and their fear of losing everything. Jesus turned to me. "Abigail, this is the choice they will face. Many will struggle, torn between their earthly needs and their spiritual convictions. But they must remember that I am with them. Those who trust me will not be abandoned." The vision ended, and I was left with a deep sense of urgency. The pressure to conform was growing, and the cost of resistance was high. But the price of giving in was far greater. The scene shifted once more. I found myself in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Everything seemed normal at first. Families were gathered on porches, children played in the yards, and neighbors chatted by their mailboxes. But as I walked further, I began to notice something unsettling. The people who had accepted the device seemed different. Their smiles were hollow, their laughter forced. Conversations revolved around how convenient and efficient life had become with the device. Yet, there was a strange emptiness in their voices, as if they had lost something they couldn't quite name. I entered a nearby grocery store. A line of customers was at the checkout, scanning their hands to pay for their purchases. A woman at the back of the line struggled to explain to the cashier that she didn't have the device. "I just need to buy some bread for my family," she pleaded. "Can I pay with cash?" The cashier shook his head firmly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we no longer accept cash or cards. The system requires the device for all transactions." Tears filled her eyes as she clutched the loaf of bread. "But my children are hungry. Isn't there anything you can do?" The other customers avoided her gaze, shuffling awkwardly in line. No one spoke up. The woman left empty-handed, her shoulders shaking as she cried. Jesus appeared beside me again. "This is what happens when they trust the world's systems," he said softly. "Those without the mark will struggle, but their faith in me will sustain them. Those who take it may feel secure at first, but they lose something far greater." The vision changed again. I was now in a hospital. A mother held her young son who was coughing and feverish. She approached the receptionist, desperation written on her face. "My son needs a doctor," she said. The receptionist glanced at her screen. "Do you have the device? We need it to verify your insurance and medical records." "I don't have it," the mother admitted. "But please, he's very sick. Isn't there another way?" The receptionist hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Without the device, we can't provide any services." The mother clung to her son as tears streamed down her face. She turned and walked away, her cries echoing down the sterile hallway. The scene shifted once more. This time, I was in a courtroom. A man stood before a judge, accused of refusing to comply with the new system. His lawyer argued on his behalf, but the judge's expression was cold. "This is not a matter of personal belief," the judge said. "The system is in place for the good of society. By refusing to participate, you are endangering others and disrupting order. I have no choice but to sentence you to confinement." The man stood tall, his voice steady, despite the verdict. "I will not bow to this system. My faith is in God, not in man." The judge's gavel came down, and the man was led away. His family sobbed quietly in the back of the courtroom. Jesus spoke again. "Many will face persecution for refusing to conform. They will lose their jobs, their homes, even their freedom. But those who remain faithful to me will find a strength the world cannot take away." The vision shifted to a small, hidden community of believers. They gathered in secret, praying and supporting one another. They had learned to live off the land, growing their own food and bartering for what they needed. Their lives were hard, but their faith was unshaken. They found joy in their fellowship and peace in knowing they had stayed true to their beliefs. "These are my faithful ones," Jesus said. "They refuse to compromise, no matter the cost. Their reward will be great." As I watched, I felt a mix of sorrow and hope. The cost of resisting the system was high, but the cost of compliance was even greater. Those who chose the mark seemed to lose a part of themselves, a connection to God that could never be restored. Jesus turned to me one final time. "Abigail, the world must know. Many will be deceived, but there is still time for some to choose wisely. Tell them what you have seen." The vision faded, and I was left standing in silence, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had witnessed. The vision shifted once again. I found myself in a massive stadium filled with people from all walks of life. A charismatic leader stood on the stage, flanked by religious figures from various faiths. The air was charged with anticipation, and the crowd hung on every word the leader spoke. "This is not just about technology," the leader said, raising his hand to reveal the glowing implant beneath his skin. "This is about unity. This is about solving the problems that have plagued humanity for generations. Together, we can create a world without poverty, without crime, without war." The crowd erupted in applause. Religious leaders standing behind him nodded in agreement, their presence lending credibility to his words. As I watched, I felt a deep sense of unease. The leader's promises sounded appealing, even noble, but there was something hollow beneath his words. I turned to Jesus, who stood beside me. "This is how they will be deceived," Jesus said, his voice heavy with sadness. "They will see this as a path to peace and prosperity, but it is a trap. The choice to accept the mark is not just physical, it is spiritual. It declares allegiance to man's systems over God's kingdom." The vision changed, and I was now standing in a church. The congregation was divided, their faces filled with confusion and fear. The pastor stood at the pulpit, addressing their concerns. "I've prayed about this," the pastor said. "This technology is not the mark of the beast. It's just a tool like a smartphone or a credit card. There's no harm in using it." Some members nodded in agreement, but others looked uncertain. One man stood up and spoke. "But what about Revelation? It warns us about a mark that will control our ability to buy or sell. How can we be sure this isn't it?" The pastor's expression hardened. "We must adapt to the times. This is about survival, not rebellion. God knows our hearts." Jesus' voice echoed in my mind. "Even some of my followers will be deceived," he said. "They will justify their decisions, believing they can serve both God and the world. But they cannot." The scene shifted again. I was in a small home where a family sat in prayer. They held hands, their faces determined but weary. On the table in front of them lay a small pile of cash, the last of their savings. "We've been faithful," the father said. "We've refused the mark, and we've trusted God to provide. But now we're out of money. We need food." The mother nodded, tears in her eyes. "We can't give in. God will make a way." As I watched, a knock came at the door. The family froze, their fear palpable. The father opened the door to find a neighbor holding a basket of food. "We know what you're going through," the neighbor said. "We're believers too. Take this. God provides for his children." The family wept with relief, their faith strengthened by the act of kindness. Jesus turned to me. "This is how my people will endure," he said. "Through faith, through community, through reliance on me." The vision changed once more. I saw a man who had accepted the implant. At first, he seemed happy, his life easier and more convenient. But over time, his demeanor changed. He became withdrawn, his joy replaced by emptiness. He tried to pray, but his words felt hollow. He opened his Bible, but the words seemed meaningless. "This is the true cost of the mark," Jesus said. "It severs their connection to me. Their hearts grow hard, and they lose the ability to hear my voice." The man stared at his reflection in the mirror, tears streaming down his face. "What have I done?" he whispered. Jesus' voice was filled with sorrow. "Once the choice is made, it cannot be undone. This is why my people must remain vigilant. The system will not announce itself as evil. It will come disguised as light." The vision ended, and I was left trembling. The stakes were clearer than ever. This was not just a physical battle. It was a spiritual one, and the consequences were eternal. The vision shifted again, and I was no longer standing in a city or a room. Instead, I found myself on a mountaintop, surrounded by a radiant glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air was alive with a sense of peace and power, unlike anything I had ever experienced. Jesus stood beside me, his presence steady and reassuring. "Look," he said, gesturing toward the horizon. I turned and saw a breathtaking scene. A vast multitude of people, dressed in white, stood together. Their faces glowed with joy and peace. They raised their hands in worship, their voices singing a melody so beautiful it brought tears to my eyes. The sound was more than music, it was pure love, filling the air and my very soul. "These are the ones who remained faithful," Jesus said. "They endured hardship, persecution, and rejection, but they never gave up. Their reward is great." The scene shifted, and I saw a different group of people. They stood apart from the multitude, their faces filled with regret and anguish. They had also received the mark, and now they saw the truth too late. They reached out toward the multitude, but there was an invisible barrier that separated them. They thought the mark would bring them security, Jesus said, but it only brought separation. The choice they made was eternal. As I watched, the heavens opened. A light brighter than the sun illuminated everything. Jesus stepped forward, clothed in majesty and glory. Behind him was an army of angels, their presence overwhelming in its power and beauty. The earth trembled, not in fear but as if it were rejoicing. The faithful fell to their knees, their faces radiant with joy. Jesus walked among them, wiping away their tears and speaking words of love and affirmation. "Well done, my good and faithful servants," he said to each one. "Enter into the joy of your Lord." The scene shifted again. I saw glimpses of what the faithful had endured. Families living in hidden communities, growing their own food and sharing resources. Children learning scripture by candlelight, their parents teaching them to trust in God above all else. Believers facing rejection and persecution, but refusing to compromise their faith. "They trusted me," Jesus said. "Even when the world turned against them, they stood firm. Their faith was their anchor, and their hope sustained them." As I watched, I felt a sense of awe and longing. The faith of these people was unshakable. They had endured so much, yet they radiated joy and peace that could not be taken away. The vision changed one final time. I saw Jesus standing before the multitude of faithful. His arms were open wide, his voice filled with love and authority. "This is the reward for those who endure," he said. "Eternal life, joy, and a place in my kingdom. The trials you face are temporary, but the reward is everlasting." I felt a fire ignite within me. I thought of the struggles I had seen, the faith of those who resisted, and the regret of those who had given in. I knew I couldn't stay silent. The world needed to know what was coming and what was at stake. The vision began to fade, and I found myself back in the hospital. The sounds of monitors and the voices of doctors filled the room. My chest ached and my body felt heavy, but my spirit was alive with purpose. I had been given a glimpse of what lay ahead, and I knew what I had to do. As I opened my eyes, the fluorescent lights of the hospital room came into focus. The hum of monitors and the muffled voices of the medical staff reminded me that I was back in the physical world. My chest ached with every breath, and my body felt weak, but my mind was alive with the urgency of what I had seen. I had been dead for 10 minutes, but what I experienced in that brief time was more real than anything I had ever known. I wasn't the same person who had collapsed in the ER. My heart was no longer weighed down by the distractions of this world. Instead, it was filled with a purpose I couldn't ignore. The visions were not just for me, they were for everyone. The world is heading toward a crossroad, and every small decision we make now is leading us closer to that pivotal moment. Jesus didn't show me these things to scare me. He showed me so that I could prepare, and so that I could warn others to prepare as well. In the days and weeks that followed, I left my career as a doctor. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew I couldn't continue with my old life. I began sharing my experience, first with family and friends, and then with anyone who would listen. Some were skeptical. Others were moved to tears. Many asked the same question: what can we do to prepare? The answer is both simple and profound. We must strengthen our faith. We must draw closer to God, trusting Him above all else. This is not a time for fear, but for action. The challenges ahead will test us in ways we can't fully imagine. But those who trust in God will not be abandoned. If this story has touched your heart or opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your family, your friends, and anyone you care about. This is a message the world needs to hear. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more life-changing insights about faith, hope, and God's promises. Together, we can stand firm, stay encouraged, and prepare for the glorious day when Jesus returns. Remember, the trials are temporary, but the reward is eternal. Stand strong, stay faithful, and let's meet again on that glorious day. Until then, God bless you, and thank you for being part of this journey. Let's walk in faith together.